Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Heading West, an online professional development seminar sponsored by the Florida Virtual School and the National Humanities Center. Those of you who have been with us before know me, but let me introduce myself to any new seminar members. I'm Richard Schramm, Vice President for Education Programs here at the Humanities Center. And this is kind of a first for me. I'm doing this seminar from my house. If you've been following the pre-seminar chat, you know that it's a snowy day here in North Carolina. We had just enough snow in Chapel Hill where I live, not to cover the grass, but to cover the roads with ice. So nobody's moving around here, but we're all safe and sound at home. Let me start with a few typical reminders. On the Heading West webpage, you'll be able to find the recording for this seminar. The PowerPoint presentation and the evaluations are there as always. Please feel free to plunder the PowerPoint for your instructional use. And it's very important to us that you complete your evaluation and you submit it to us online. We do pay attention to those, and they're also important for your Teaching American History project. As always, you'll receive documentation of participation for your participation in the seminar so that you'll be able to present that to local certifying authorities to get whatever recertification credit this seminar warrants. Are there any questions before we plunge ahead? If everybody's ready to go, send me a little smiley face and we'll move ahead. It's cold up here and I get to coach a game Thursday night. I didn't realize that North Florida was almost as cold as we are. Someone, Joe Linda said, was 38 in North Florida. Other parts of Florida are in the 80s. Seems unfair, doesn't it? Okay, it seems that we're all ready to go. So let's move ahead then. Our goals for this seminar are three. First, we want to deepen your understanding of the pre-Civil War westward migration. Then we want to explore connections between westward expansion and the coming of the Civil War. And as always, we want to provide some fresh material to strengthen your teaching. Now, we explored the form, and on the form, you wrote these particular challenges, issues, and questions. It appears that westward expansion in the 1840s is often taught as part of a continuum of movement that includes, among other topics, the Lewis and Clark expedition, the debate over internal improvements, and Indian removal. And speaking of Indian removal, you may want to check our website, Nature Transformed. There's a very good essay there on Indian removal. There are a couple of other essays in Divining America, our teacher-served website. I mentioned all of those on the forum. So if you'd like to find those, please go to the forum and you'll see, excuse me, you'll see links for them there. Now, furthermore, on the forum, people have mentioned that students often overlook the importance of westward expansion in the establishment of the United States. The compromises caused confusion. Was it the Missouri Compromise or the Compromise of 1850? They always confused me too. Two questions arose: what motivated people to head west, and what sort of people made the journey? To help us address all those points, we are pleased to have with us this morning Elliott West, Alumni Distinguished Professor of History at the University of Arkansas. His main research interests focus on the American West and the American Indian. He's written widely on both topics, and you can see some of the text that he's written there. In the picture, he is mentoring a future graduate student. Let me turn the program over to Elliott now so that he can begin the seminar. Elliott, I'm going to pass the baton to you, and it is all yours.
All right. Thank you so much, and greetings to all of you folks. This is my first experience with one of these webinars, as I learned they're called. Looking forward to it. I've worked with teachers in Florida before at Teaching American History grants for a couple of occasions, and I look forward to doing it now on this in this other way. First of all, let me make a couple of points regarding the questions raised and the points made on the from the forum. Students often overlook the importance of westward expansion in the establishment of the United States. Amen. that is really the truth. And I think one of the things that I hope to get across this morning and when we meet again in May is just how significant westward expansion was to American history, not only in the 1840s, the period we're going to look at today, but throughout that period. It's really one of the fundamental shaping forces in all of American history. And it's too bad that it's often considered a kind of a sidelight. It's also the part of American history that probably has brought about the most myth making. When we think of all of the stories and the myths and the characters that come out of Westward Expansion. Those are the things that we remember, and we too seldom think about how Westward Expansion in so many different ways shaped the development of this country. So I hope to elaborate on that a bit. The two questions there at the bottom: what motivated people to head west, and what sort of people made the journey? I'd like to elaborate on those when we meet again in May. That I think has to do with a great deal with what we're going to be talking about then. But very briefly here, what motivated people to head west? Well, I think if there was one single reason, it was opportunity, economic opportunity. The West represented, as we'll see today, represented to most Americans the future for the nation, but the future, more importantly in their case, of their families and their own people. So they wanted to go west mainly to improve their condition, to take a few steps up the economic ladder. There were other reasons as well, of course. Perhaps one of the most pervasive from the very beginning was the chance to start over collectively, sort of social opportunity. And the most obvious expression of that is religion. The West is a place where people could go to begin new religious communities. In the far West, the obvious example of the Mormons. What sort of people made the journey? Well, just about everybody. The people who were least likely to head west, I think, were the poorest. Remember that to head west, you had to have something of a stake, something of a something to make your new life with. And so the very poorest people tended to stay home, but just about everybody else went. One of the things I want to emphasize in May is that this, among other things, made the American West, the far West, the most ethnically, culturally diverse part of the nation. We often think of the East Coast, the part of the country where you folks live, as the one that is the great melting pot. But it was the West from the 1840s and 50s up until today that has been the most ethnically mixed part of the country by far, and it still is today. Are there any other questions that folks have at this point before we get going?
Elliott, could you just comment a little more on that ethnic diversity, because that's a point I think that might be worth exploring either here today or in May, because so often the origins of ethnic diversity are taught in the late 19th century, massive immigration to the East Coast cities. Of course, you don't have Native Americans in the East Coast cities, but you do have African Americans, particularly after the Great Migration. So could you just, if we don't want to take a whole lot of time, this is something you're probably going to take up in May, but just kind of a profile. Who were all these ethnically diverse people in the East, in the West? Excuse me.
In the West, just about everybody. Let me give you a kind of a stunning statistic. If you were to look at the U.S. Census of 1870 and ask yourself, where of all the states and territories of the United States, where would you find those with the highest percentage of foreign-born persons? I think most people would say the Atlantic coast. Would say states like New York and Massachusetts. Well, in fact, the state on the Atlantic coast that had the highest percentage of foreign-born persons was New York, and that percentage was about 25%. About 1 out of every 4 persons in 1870 in the state of New York was born outside the United States. Now, if you were to pick up the state of New York and move it into the far west, and then ask where would New York stand in the ranking of the states with the most with the highest percentage of foreign-born in the far west, New York would place 9th. There were 8 western states and territories in the far west with a higher percentage of foreign-born persons than New York on the East Coast. The state with the highest percentage of foreign-born persons was Idaho, with about 2/3, about 2 out of every 3 people in Idaho had been born outside the United States. Montana had well more than half of its people born outside the United States, and they were from all over. An incredible variety of peoples in the far west. So it was the West that was the great melting pot. Now remember, that just measures those who have been born outside the United States and come to the United States. That doesn't measure American Indians. That does not measure Hispanic peoples. They're counted as being born within the United States. So they're counted as native born, and yet, of course, culturally, they were vastly different from the American mainstream. So we get this impression, it's one of the myths of the West, that as you move from east to west, you're moving into sort of blue-eyed white bread country, sort of sort of the American mainstream. But in fact, it was precisely the opposite. The case was precisely the opposite. The farther west you went, the more you moved into country that we usually associate with the East. That is, ethnic variety, an incredible splay of peoples, the great American melting pot, or the mixed salad, or whichever metaphor you want to use.
Okay, well, thank you.
All right, the two seminars I mentioned, we're going to be dealing today with the ways in which, focusing today on the ways in which the American West and American expansion, Westward expansion, contributed to the coming of the Civil War. The next time we meet in May, I'd like to focus on how the American West after the Civil War helped shape the American nation and some of its importance. Let me begin by making just a general statement here that I'd like all of you to think about, both today and in May. And it's this. Between 1848 and 1865, the United States, this country, was, in a sense, remade. America in 1865 was essentially a different nation from what it had been in 1848. It was the most consequential 20 years or so in American history. And if you take that a little bit farther into the 1870s, that transformation was even greater. So in effect, think of America as being literally reconstructed, remade during those years. Two events did that. We normally think of the American Civil War as a great transforming event, and it was. But what I want to suggest to you today is that the Civil War was only one of two transforming events. The other one was Westward Expansion. And it's those two events together that remade the United States. So what I'd like for you to think about today and in May is kind of a back and forth, a resonance between the East and the West. As we acquired the far West, changes began to happen. And those changes began to happen because of the way in which the new lands in the West began to affect the East, and in turn how Eastern politics, Eastern issues, Eastern values, Eastern debates began to shape the far West. So please think about how these two events together were beginning to remake this nation. Let's begin with some fundamentals here. This is a map showing the course of westward expansion from the beginning of the nation until today. Now look down here. Begin with Texas. In 1845, Texas was annexed to the United States, became part of this country, and Texas at that time included that whole purple area, all that Texas claimed, all the way including more than half of New Mexico, way up into Colorado. The next year, 1846, the United States, in a treaty with Great Britain, acquired the Pacific Northwest, so-called Oregon country. And in that same year, 1846, the United States went to war with Mexico. And 2 years later, 1848, in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the United States acquired all of the American Southwest, the so-called Mexican Secession, down there in the lower left-hand corner of the nation. So between 1845 and 1848, the United States acquired, it comes up to just about 1,200,000 square miles, 1.2 million square miles. That turns out to be about 750 million, with a B, 750 million acres of land in 3 years. In 3 years. That's about half again the size of all of the Louisiana Purchase. It was far and away the greatest expansion in American history. And to put this in perspective, think of it this way: what would this country look like if we were to acquire that much territory, 1.2 million square miles, over the next 3 years? Let's say between 2010 and 2013, the United States expanded. We can't expand to the west without getting wet, but let's say we expanded southward to that much territory. Where would we be? What would we acquire? If we did that, we would expand We would acquire all of Mexico. We would acquire all of Guatemala and Honduras and Nicaragua, all of Central America, and about 1/2 of the nation of Colombia. So think of it in those terms. What would this country be like? What would happen if during the next 3 years, by 2013, we expanded all the way into the northern part of South America? What are some of the issues? Let me ask you folks. What are some of the issues? What are some of the questions, some of the opportunities, the challenges that would arise from that?
Okay. What are some of the challenges that would come up if the United States expanded? Poverty, language.
Yes, right. What else?
Difficulty managing the territory, diseases, cultural differences, establishing legitimate authority, social services, expansion, loss of. Let's take Canada. Enforcing the laws, economic opportunity. I think I think our participants have covered the waterfront pretty well.
Pretty much. You're requiring, an enormous variety of peoples, a huge variety of terrain. In terms of opportunities, there's a lot of possibilities down there. Mexico is one of the great oil-producing nations of the world. We're in an energy crisis right now. Suddenly, we get all of that Mexican oil, all of that opportunity and wealth to the south, but also, of course, incredible challenges. Beginning with the fact that a lot of those people probably would not want to be part of the United States. We'd have to. None of those people have had experience in American government or values. So somehow absorbing that much territory, that many people, those many cultures, what a challenge. Well, that was the kind of challenge that we faced in 1848. Suddenly, in 1848, we would have to begin to grapple with those kinds of problems. And remember, this in 1848, this was a nation without the kinds of technology that we have today. Somehow we're going to have to bring that part of the country, the far west, into this nation without the kinds of technology, the kind of communication, the kind of transportation that we have today. So the point here, obvious point to make here is that the expansion to the far west raised all sorts of questions, new questions, raised all sorts of possibilities, and perhaps most importantly, raised all sorts of problems that we had to begin to deal with. Now, one of the most immediate issues that acquiring the far west raised had to do with something really fundamental, and that is the very nature of the American character. Who were we as Americans? What were our values? What was our future? Now, a classic expression of this is found in this very famous editorial by John Sullivan, a New York journalist in 1839, on the eve of this expansion. It's from this editorial. You don't see exactly the phrase in the editorial, but it's from this editorial where the very famous phrase "manifest destiny" came. Here's what O'Sullivan wrote, among other things. All this will be our future history, to establish on earth the moral dignity and salvation of man, the immutable truth and the beneficence of God. For this blessed mission to the nations of the world, which are shut out from the life-giving light of truth, has America been chosen. So America has a blessed mission to expand over as much of the earth as possible its own sway, which was, of course, that of moral dignity and salvation. Now, let's go back to the very beginning. The classic expression of this, of course, is this painting, John Gast. I suspect that most or all of you have used this in class. Is that the case?
If you've used Gast's painting in class, send us a check so that we can take a quick poll here. We rarely ever use this feature. Some people have, some people haven't.
Yeah, well,
see, a few people have. There we go. There's some checks. Yeah. Good number.
Well, if you haven't, you ought to consider it. It's certainly one of the most teachable images that you can use. What are some obvious things to see here that fit in with O'Sullivan's famous famous statement on manifest destiny? What do you see here? Who's the figure in the floating across the land?
Peter Billingsley notes that a westward expansion in this picture seems to be endorsed by God. True.
Absolutely.
Angel up there.
I
always like the sunset to the east, the sunrise rather, in behind the angel, dispelling the dark clouds in front of her.
Right. So it's light coming into darkness. Who are the figures who are marching westward with this Lady Liberty here?
Is the angel Columbia?
She's meant to be Columbia. She's sort of the feminine expression of the American character.
And I'm sorry, this image isn't larger. Is she carrying a Bible or the Constitution, Elliott?
That's a book of laws.
So
she's bringing American legal institutions.
And we say progress is heading west. Steamboats, trains, yes, led by horses and Conestoga wagons with overland stages, and then finally back there the railroad and telegraph lines. So this is high-tech 19th century.
Exactly. So what we see here is, among other things, this is O'Sullivan's idea of manifest destiny. But by 1872, when Gast gave us this image, technology had become increasingly important here. So part of Americans' destiny, part of America's superiority, was its technological superiority.
Now, Elliott, Patrick has noted there are no natives in the painting. I think it's because this is too small. Aren't they Native Americans there in the very front on the left-hand side being pushed?
Yes. If you could look, they're sort of looking furtively over their shoulders. They're being driven westward, fleeing the light, along with the bison. Right above those Indian peoples, you can see bison also running westward, away from the advance of progress. Yeah.
Right. If we had a bigger image, that would be more obvious.
Be clear. Yeah. Now, if you look over to the far right, it's something that folks often do not notice in this painting. Just under the sunrise there. Anybody get a sense of what that might be? A body of water.
Ships. Yeah.
It's Manhattan. That's Manhattan Island. And if you were to blow this up and look at it closely, you would see the Brooklyn Bridge.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So this is again another expression of American technological superiority. So this is an image of America as the chosen people. We are God's chosen, and because of that, we not only have a right to expand westward, but we also have an obligation, and that's the point here. I think that's the point that O'Sullivan is making. We are obliged to expand westward because we are God's chosen. So this is a kind of an expression of the New Zion. There's a very powerful religious undertone to this as well, and that's one way that Americans interpreted this expansion to the west. But there were others. Here is Walt Whitman, the most famous American, the most American poet of the mid 19th century, writing the Brooklyn Daily Eagle. America knows how to crush as well as how to expand. So Whitman was celebrating our victory over Mexico by saying that not only was this a rightful conquest, rightful expansion, but this was but this also demonstrated American military superiority as a people of power. But look at the next one, Frederick Douglass. Now, assuming all of you know, of course, Douglass, an escaped slave, a man who becomes probably the most recognizable leader, black leader of the abolitionist movement before the Civil War. Here's Douglass. Our nation seems resolved to rush on in her wicked career, though the road be ditched with human blood and paved with human skulls. two very, very different views within a couple of years of each other of of the of the war and what it meant. So what we see here is a war that brings out this xenophobia, brings out this American sense of superiority, moral superiority, and military superiority. At the same time, that others are saying that this is bringing out the very worst in the American character. It's the kind of bitter division that I think to bring it up to the present, that you see happening in this country more recently. A bitter divide. In this case, and what do we see here? We see the West and Westward Expansion bringing that out. Now let's see, Richard, were you able to get in the
yes, I did.
Images that they've heard?
Yeah, if you can go on. There we go. And the next one is the editorial.
Yeah. Okay. Now my slide doesn't show a map.
You're not seeing the map?
I see the title here, Mexico 1847. Does everybody else have the map?
Oh, I have the map on my no map. No, okay, just the date. I don't understand that. I've got it here. In any event, let's just wing it.
Okay, let's wing it. Let's go back to got a map here. Here, okay. Now, if you were able to project southward, imagine Mexico down here, down below this particular map. Mexico, remember, up until 1848, extended all the way up to the Oregon country, to that line along, it's the 42nd parallel, the line along the northern boundary of California. And Mexico, remember, claimed Texas. Mexico had never recognized the Republic of Texas. So what the Mexican War did, in effect, was divide the nation of Mexico in two. Mexico in 1848 lost 1/2 of its territory. Now ask yourself, what would happen if we went to war and lost 1/2 of the present 48 states? What would be the effect of that on us? The effect on Mexico was absolutely devastating. Mexican historians. Here's the famous Mexican eagle. The eagle, of course, is a symbol of Mexico as well as of the United States before and after the war.
Any comments? What would happen if the United States suddenly lost 1/2 of its territory? It would certainly be a poorer country, less diverse. Depends on which half we lost, I suppose.
Yes, right.
Yeah, we would destroy the economy. Yeah, and it would be a tremendous psychological blow. I mean, it would destroy whatever national confidence we might have had.
Yeah.
Yeah, GNP disease, precisely. Economic and political chaos. Yeah, the political ramifications would be profound in this country. It wouldn't be who lost China; it would be who lost California or whatever. So the psychological impact on and what were some of the impacts on Mexico then, Elliott?
Well, Mexican historians generally regard this as the single worst thing that ever happened in the history of that nation. They lost enormous resources, the potential for future expansion. And as a couple of folks have mentioned here, politically, this was absolutely devastating. It led to a series of, to a long period of political chaos and division. So if you're living in, the Mexican War, I think for many Americans today is a largely forgotten episode. If you were to go out on a city street and stop 10 people and ask them if they'd ever heard of the Mexican War, maybe one had. They probably couldn't tell you much about it. It's really an event that doesn't have much standing in the American memory. But for the Mexican people, it's a hugely important event. So among other things, what I'm suggesting here is that the war with Mexico, this little recognized war in our history, had a profound impact upon America's relations with Mexico and, in fact, with all of our neighbors to the south.
Can we address Shauna's question here? Wasn't there a civil war going on within Mexico at the time?
Yes, there was a civil war, was a little strong for it. There was civil war followed the war with Mexico, not too long after that, and there have been wars on and off before that. But Mexico was in politically a bitterly divided nation politically leading up to the war. It was one of the complicating factors in Mexico dealing with the United States leading up to the war and the coming of the War of Mexico itself. Yeah.
Okay. We have about an hour.
Okay. All righty. Well, let me just reiterate a little bit about that. This was, in a way, the Mexican War was, in a way, a great turning point in hemispheric diplomacy. Before the war, especially up until about the 1830s, the United States was regarded by the people of Mexico, by the people of Latin America generally, as sort of their godfather. The United States, they looked upon the United States as the nation that was showing them the way to independence. We, after all, had conducted the first successful colonial revolution in modern history. We were the first in our Revolutionary War. We were the first of the New World nations to successfully break away from our colonial masters. And the rest of Latin America saw us as leading the way. We were the great heroes to the people of the South. In fact, today, if any of you have a chance to go down to the Texas-Mexico border on George Washington's birthday, you will find a huge celebration. Washington is still seen as a great hero among the people of Mexico. The Mexican War changed that. With the Mexican War, we became what we have really been ever since, and that is the great bully of the North. We were seen as not as a nation leading the way, not as a hero, but as an oppressor, a conqueror. And that would color relations between the United States and Mexico, the United States and Latin America, the United States and all of the lands to the south of us profoundly from then on. So I think it's a point that's rarely, I think, recognized. But this was one of the consequences of the war as well. But within this country, the effects were also profound, and in many ways profoundly disruptive and dangerous. Ralph Waldo Emerson, in a famous statement, called the war with Mexico a dose of arsenic for the United States. He said it was poisonous. And why would that be? It's because that division that you saw in those statements between Whitman and Douglas, that are really divisions over the very nature of the American character, that came to focus on one particular question, the prime issue of the day, that summed up this debate about what America was, what it was to be, what our values were, the nature of the nation itself, and that issue was slavery, the question of slavery. And specifically, whether or not, in this case, whether or not slavery would be allowed into these new territories, new lands acquired to the far west. Now, I asked in a note to the forum, I asked folks to review, to go back through their texts and to review in their own work fundamental events, the basic events between 1845 and the coming of the war in 1861. I hope everyone had a chance to do that. And if so, you know then that the acquisition of the far west then immediately triggered this question of slavery in the far west, or whether slavery would be allowed in these territories. And that in turn led to this very famous debate It had to do essentially with this document, the Wilmot Proviso. David Wilmot was a young representative from Pennsylvania, and as the United States went to war with Mexico, the president at the time, James Polk, of course, needed money. It's a familiar issue. Needed money to fight this war, and so he went to Congress, as he has to do, and beginning in the House of Representatives, as he has to do under the Constitution. He asked the House of Representatives for money to prosecute this war. And out of the blue, David Wilmot, this little-known representative from Pennsylvania, introduced this proposal. Oops, that's not the one.
I think one more back. It's there. Go back one more.
There it is. Okay, thank you.
There we go.
Provided that as an express and fundamental condition to the acquisition of any territory from the Republic of Mexico by the United States, by virtue of any treaty which may be negotiated between them, and to the use by the executive of the monies herein appropriated, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall ever exist in any part of said territory, except for crime whereof the penalty shall first be duly convicted. That is, unless you're convicted of a crime and put in prison. So what's he saying? Wilmot is saying, okay, you can have the money, President Polk. You can have the money, but to fight this war. But any territory that you acquire with that money, with that war, will be free of slavery. No slaves will be allowed. No slaves will be allowed into it. So what this did then was to reopen the question that had supposedly been settled. Long ago with the Missouri Compromise. Would slavery then be allowed in the West? In 1820, the question arose regarding the Louisiana Purchase. And in the Missouri Compromise of 1820, a line was drawn just about 20 miles north of where I'm sitting right now, along the southern boundary of Missouri. And the Missouri Compromise said that all land to the north of that line would be slavery would not be allowed north of that line. South of that line, in what's today Arkansas and Oklahoma, slavery would be allowed. So in 1820, supposedly the question of whether Southerners would be allowed to take their slaves westward, that supposedly was settled. And now, with the acquisition of all of this new territory, the issue was raised again. Any questions at this point?
There seems to be some confusion about the date. I think it's the Missouri Compromise. Some folks 1829, 1820.
No, 1820.
1820. Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Any other questions?
Anything else? Okay, Elliott, you can move ahead.
Okay. So this then was the question that they were that they are raising. Would slavery be allowed into this country? Now, this was fought out specifically in the Senate, in the House of Representatives, over a series of bills about what to do with that land that was acquired. And what I've given you here are two statements summing up the two sides of this. The first is by John Caldwell Calhoun from South Carolina. Calhoun, of course, had been a prominent figure in American politics since the time of the War of 1812. He was, at this point, the leading spokesman for the Southern position. He was about to die, along with Henry Clay. These two great lions of the Senate would be dead within a year or so. Now, here's Calhoun's statement. The North is making the most strenuous efforts. He's talking now about Wilmot. Making the most strenuous efforts to appropriate the whole of the territory acquired from Mexico to herself by excluding the South from every foot of it. The United States, since they declared their independence, have acquired 2,373,046 square miles of territory, from which the North will have excluded the South if she should succeed in monopolizing the newly acquired territories, about 3/4 of the whole, leading to the South only about 1/4. So Calhoun is saying here that if Wilmot's idea carries, and that if slavery is, and that if he gets his way, that the South, I notice he's saying the entire region, the South will be excluded from that country. Now, what's the assumption behind this? Why is he saying the South would be excluded? Southerners, certainly, Southerners could go into this new land.
Okay, what does he mean there by the South? Any suggestions? Okay, slaveholders, yes, indeed.
Slaveholders, okay.
Economically excluded by not allowing slavery there. Is he deifying the South as slaveholders?
Is this defining the South? Or
defining. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I couldn't read that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the whole southern plantation economy, the whole notion of Southern culture would be excluded.
Right. So Calhoun here is implicitly identifying the South with slavery. The South and the institution of slavery are inextricable. They are bound together. And so what he's saying is this is in effect an act of regional oppression, regional exclusion. The other side, taken by William Seward. Now, if Calhoun was a sort of a dying light, an old lion who had been around for decades, who was about to pass from the scene, Seward was one of these rising stars. William Seward, a congressman from New York, who would go on, of course, to be Secretary of State under Abraham Lincoln, to become a leading figure of the Republican Party. Now, here he is giving his ideas about this. But there is a higher law than the Constitution, which regulates our authority over the domain and devotes it to the same noble purposes. The territory, now he's talking now about the land acquired from Mexico, the territory is a part, no inconsiderable part, of the common heritage of mankind, bestowed upon them by the Creator of the universe. We are his stewards, and must so discharge our trust as to secure in the highest attainable degree their happiness, that is, the happiness of mankind. So what you see here are two very, very different statements. Calhoun is identifying the South with slavery. Calhoun is saying that by excluding slavery, in effect, the Congress would be excluding Southerners and the Southern way of life, the Southern economy, Southern culture. Seward is saying, well, there is really a larger and a higher point here, and that has to do with the very basic values of humankind, and how the United States has a responsibility to that. Any comments on these two? What can you draw from seeing these two statements next to each other?
Well, Linda has mentioned how jarring it is to read Calhoun and Seward statements side by side, and it is jarring. I mean, it shows the tremendous gap between the two regions, and also Calhoun is much more political, it would seem, and Seward has in some ways transcends politics. But Amy writes, not much room for compromise between the two views.
Absolutely, that's right. That's right. Again, it's always dangerous, of course, to try to bring in the present when you're looking at the past. But when I read these things, I say, boy, there's a disturbingly familiar ring to this. How again, in this case, expansion to the West. How the West is tearing this country apart. The West, the issues involved by acquiring this new territory are forcing apart these two sections that have always been at odds. Have been at odds for a long time, but now are moving rapidly apart from each other.
And Peter writes, was Calhoun simply stating the obvious at that point, or was this a revelation?
Well, it depends on which historians you read. There's no question that slavery was absolutely woven through the Southern economy, but historians disagree whether slavery would necessarily have been possible in the West. Now, some historians say that by emphasizing that slavery was really most important for the cotton economy. Slaves were used in the South more than any other single way to grow cotton because cotton was the greatest export of the South. Now today, cotton is grown throughout the far West. Anybody want to guess what the leading cotton producing state in the United States is?
Anyone take a guess there?
Arizona.
It's Arizona.
Arizona and California produce huge amounts of cotton. But that was, of course, not possible back then. So some historians say that because slavery and cotton and King Cotton were so closely entwined, and because cotton could not, at that time, cotton would not be grown in Arizona and California and elsewhere, that slavery in practical terms would not expand, would not go into that. So what they were saying, what these historians, and Daniel Webster made this point during these same debates, that really this is a moot question because slavery probably would not be possible to expand into the West. Now, most historians today would disagree with that. Most historians today would say, yes, it would. That slavery could be used in all kinds of activities that were in the West, beginning with mining. Why not put slaves into in the gold and silver mines of the far West? Other kinds of large-scale agriculture in the West. So, to get back to that question, Calvin, in a way, was kind of stating the obvious. I think from the way that most people thought about this, by excluding slavery from the South, that the government would be preventing the Southern economy as it existed then from moving into the far West. Anything else look at Seward's statement here. There is a higher law than the Constitution, which regulates our authority over the domain and devotes it to the same noble purposes. The territory, the West, is no inconsiderable part of the common heritage of mankind. So as Richard said, this is very high. This is very high-blown, very moralistic. Speaking of our values, that we must be stewards for this new land. What does that remind you of? That we looked at just earlier.
Set off any familiar echoes?
Manifest destiny. Absolutely.
There we go.
Absolutely. So isn't that kind of interesting? Isn't that kind of interesting? What Seward is doing here is appealing to that very sense of American destiny, of America's peculiar obligation and duty to set a higher moral standard. That's our mission. But what Seward is saying here is that if you really believe that, he's saying to Americans, if you really believe that Americans have a moral mission that keeps slavery out. So there were those who said that this American mission, that our moral superiority gave us the right, the duty to conquer others, to crush the Mexicans. Seward is saying that same obligation, that same duty, was one that tells us now that we must keep slaves out, because slavery, after all, is a terrible sin.
We have two interesting points here in the chat. Diana notes that the phrase "securing happiness" also uses the Declaration of Independence theme.
Yes.
And then Shauna asks a question about Seward himself. Was he religious, or is this a rhetorical ploy?
I think he was. I think a little of both. He certainly was a very religious man, and like many, he was an abolitionist, of course, and like many abolitionists, he was motivated very, very much by religious values. Yeah. But he was also, of course, a politician, and a very good one, and very shrewd, as Diana says there. Securing happiness, it's sort of a clear echo of the Declaration of Independence.
Shauna notes we see the same appeal coming up in the Spanish-American War sometime later.
Yes, in the same debate. Isn't that interesting? In the Spanish-American War, those who press for the war, those who argue for American going to war with Spain, and then looking to the Pacific, toward our conquest of the Philippines, use the same kind of rhetoric used to justify our war with Mexico. And then once we win the war, you see the same kinds of arguments appealing to a higher law, appealing to America's moral mission. Same sorts of arguments used to condemn what we were doing in the Philippines. So this is an ongoing theme, and you can sort of, if you think of the Spanish-American War, is the next stage of westward expansion. In this case, westward all the way across the Pacific Ocean into Southeast Asia. Okay, any other comments on these two quotes?
Anything else? Okay, Elliott, we have about 40 minutes left.
Okay, and yet, let's step back from this a little bit. What we see so far is this confrontation between Southerners who identify their region and their economy and their way of life with slavery, saying that they have every right to move with their culture and their way of life and their economy, and therefore with their slaves into the far west. And Seward, and those taking this very high moral ground and saying, no, we must exclude slavery from the far west because slavery is a moral crime, because it is our duty, moral duty as Americans, to live by this higher standard. That looks like, at this point, that looks like what's going on here. That looks like the conflict over whether or not slaves will be allowed into the far west. But there's something else happening here that's critical to understanding. It's often overlooked, but critical to understanding what was going on. Now this is a Wilmot Proviso, but this is not part of the Proviso. This is that same fellow, David Wilmot. Now, and he's arguing for the Proviso in Congress. But look what he says. Why is Wilmot saying we should keep slavery out of this land acquired with the money that Congress is giving Polk to prosecute the war? You say, well, understand, I have no squeamish sensitiveness upon the subject of slavery. I have no morbid sympathy for the slave. I plead the cause and rights of white freemen. I would preserve for the free white labor a fair country, a rich inheritance, where the sons of toil, my own race and my own color, can live without disgrace, which association with Negro slavery brings upon free labor. What's he saying here?
Okay. Any interpretations here? We have one, ironically noting he's not too much of a white supremacist.
He's very much a white supremacist.
Yes, that's very common at that time, of course.
It was, yeah.
Yeah. Well, he's making the case here for the freemen, the white freemen. He wants to preserve the West for the yeoman farmers.
Right.
Kind of like today, our not giving our jobs to immigrants. Slavery makes free labor unable to compete, destroys opportunities for them. And he's definitely pushing for white free labor, yes.
Yeah. So when we look at the debates, like, the debate between, in these instances, Calhoun and Seward, it looks like, the question is over the morality of slavery. And it looks like that those who were opposing the expansion of slavery into the West are agreeing with Seward, and they're doing so out of sympathy for the slaves. But at least as powerful a motive, and many historians would say today a much more powerful motive for keeping slavery out of the West was not a matter of sympathy for the slaves. Most Northerners didn't care whether slavery existed in the South or not. The great motive here was to keep the new lands white, to preserve the opportunity that was there in the far West for white workers, white freemen, as Wilmot calls it.
Joe, Linda makes an interesting point here. This entire debate is going on without any mention of the Indians in the West. It's as if the land were totally unpopulated.
Yes. Yes.
And Jack Carter asks, what are the demographics of the time? I suppose, Jack, maybe you mean the demographics of the West, that the population we were encompassing, and then are the cities crowded? So there are a bunch of questions there, Elliott. Could you sort those out for us?
Sure. The debate about the Indians, that's absolutely true. That simply was not an issue. It just didn't come up. No one was raising the question: should we be acquiring this territory that, after all, is inhabited by people already? So this is it was simply not considered relevant at the time. They were not part of the debate. In terms of the demographics, we'll talk about that in just a second when I raise another point. But the American West was at this time overwhelming in terms of the percentage of its population, overwhelmingly Native American and Hispanic. There were pockets of population that had moved from east to west in far western Oregon, in Utah, of course, with the Mormons, a smattering of population of whites in 1848 in California, that is of Americans from the east in California. But all of that was about to change dramatically. We'll look at that in much greater detail in May. But that was the demographics at this point. Any other questions here at this point?
Okay. Anything else? Okay, Elliott, I think we can move ahead.
Okay, so Wilmot is being very careful here to say to his colleagues, don't misunderstand. I don't care about slavery itself. I have no morbid sympathy for the slaves. I'm concerned with white freemen, and that was the motive behind keeping slavery out of the West, and that was probably the primary motive of keeping slavery out of the West. You can see this in the case of Oregon. Oregon Oregon Territory, acquired from Great Britain in 1846 with the Oregon Treaty. When the Oregon Territory was organized, one of the very first acts taken by the legislature in Oregon was to declare it to ban slavery. So Oregon then becomes a free territory, that is a non-slave territory. Now, if you were to listen to Mr. Seward, you would think that that was done out of sympathy for Southern slaves. But look at what they did next. In the same session of the legislature, in fact, almost directly on the heels of the territorial legislature banning slavery, it passed this law. Be it enacted by the Legislative Assembly of the Territory of Oregon that it shall not be lawful for any Negro or mulatto to enter into or reside within the limits of this territory, provided that nothing in this act shall apply to any Negro or mulatto now resident in this territory, nor shall it apply to the offspring of any such a residence.
Quick question here, Elliott. Suzanne asked,
Sure.
Was that a condition of the agreement with Britain?
No.
Okay.
No. This was simply an expression of the desires of the people who were settling Oregon from the United States. So what were they saying? They were saying, number one, no slaves. Number two, no free Negroes, no free blacks. So if you exclude slaves and free blacks, what you're doing is, of course, keeping Oregon white, really white. Now by the way, this law of 1849 was a revision of an earlier law that was passed by a temporary Oregon legislature before. That law said that any black person who presently in Oregon must leave within a certain amount of time, and if any black person that did not leave would be given 40 lashes on the back, the biblical 39 lashes on the back, and every 60 days, if that person was still there, that person would be lashed as well.
We have a question here. How long did this law last, and was it really enforced?
It was sporadically enforced. It lasted until the period after the Civil War. It was on the books. Now, there were, to be sure, some blacks that were allowed to be in Oregon, allowed to stay there. For the most part, they were pressured to leave, and in some cases, imprisoned and expelled.
So it was enforced, yeah.
Yes, yeah. So that's an important point to remember, that the impulse to keep slavery out of the territory acquired for the West was really at least as much, or I think probably more, the case of a sort of a racist determination to keep the land acquired from the West lily white. Okay, so the Compromise of 1850, the second of these maps here, in effect did keep slavery out of the far West. Up here, Oregon, the Oregon country acquired was already non-slave. The Compromise of 1850 admitted California as a free state, a non-slave state. It left up to Utah and New Mexico whether they would permit slavery. But those legislatures very quickly forbid slavery, and more to the point, they forbid free slaves, free blacks. New Mexico passed the New Mexican territorial legislature passed a law very much like that of Oregon, forbidding free blacks to move as well. So the Compromise of 1850 was called a compromise, but from the Southern point of view, it was not much of a compromise. They didn't really get anything out of that that they had desired. Okay, now another event that would aggravate and would complicate this question of westward expansion enormously. It was what I would call, without competition, the greatest single coincidence in American history. As I mentioned before, the War with Mexico ended in 1848 with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. That treaty was signed in a suburb of Mexico City on February the 2nd, 1848. January 24th, 1848, gold was discovered in Northern California along the American River by a man named James Marshall. Now, if you sit down and figure that out, it was just about 200 hours before we acquired California that we began to realize, we began to discover that what we had acquired with California was the richest place on earth by far. California gold production between 1848 and 1858 had a huge impact on both the American and the world economy. The gold rush in California proved to be the greatest single concentration of wealth in the history of the world up until that time. Put it another way, more gold was produced in the world between 1848 and 1858 than between 1492 and 1848. That is, in the 10 years after the discovery of gold in Northern California, more gold was produced than between Columbus's voyage in 1492 and the discovery of that gold. Unbelievable amount of wealth began to pour out of California. Here's a one way to get this across to your students. I ran across this last year when I was doing research out in California. In 1852, 4 years after this discovery, in 1852, there was a mint now in San Francisco, and the mint was built there, of course, to process all of this gold that was being produced. So much gold was being turned into bars and bricks in 1852, about 8,000 ounces of gold per month, that the furnaces couldn't handle it all. And it turned out they discovered that gold was being literally blown out of the smokestacks of the mint. And when they discovered that, they sent workers out with brooms around the surrounding rooftops for about 100 yards in all directions from the mint to sweep up the gold that was being lost from the chimneys of the mint. Now, that's the kind of wealth that we're talking about.
So the streets literally were paved with gold.
The roofs, at least. The roofs, at least, were literally being paved with gold. There's so much of it was being produced.
Shauna has a question here. The abundance of the gold rush, the amount of gold in California, was that better technology or was that better luck?
Both. It turns out that this was the greatest deposit of gold in the world that we would discover until well into the 20th century, when we began to find gold in places like South Africa. So that was luck. The fact that we just happened to have acquired, at the very moment that we acquired California, we began to realize that this was the richest place on the planet. Part of it was also better technology, because once we began to realize how much gold was there, California became the great laboratory of the world for both mining and for the processing of gold, and then later silver in Nevada. Any other questions here on this?
Any questions? Okay, Elliott.
Okay. So here is the here's a statement from the man who was the military governor of California, Richard Barnes Mason, who went in the summer following the discovery to investigate, and he found, to his astonishment, that all the rumors were absolutely true. And he wrote now to President Polk, who is about to leave the office. I have no hesitation in saying that there is more gold in the country drained by the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers than will pay the cost of the present war with Mexico 100 times over. So he's saying that he sends the word back that the war was worth it, in effect. Not only was it worth it, whatever we paid to prosecute the war with Mexico, we will win this back dozens and dozens and scores of times over by this country.
Carrie raises an interesting point here, because whenever this is taught and whenever you see this in history books or in films and so forth, you always hear that the average miner really didn't find much gold, and that the people who made a lot of money were the ones who sold supplies to the miners. So how does the fate of the average miner square with this great abundance of gold in California?
That's a great point. And there's no really easy answer to it. And I have studied this myself, looking at literally hundreds of diaries and of accounts and letters of people who went out there. I think it's fair to say that most of those who went, especially during those early years, 1848, 49 until the mid-1850s, if they applied themselves, this is brutally hard work, but if they applied themselves and if they didn't turn around and blow it, the gold that they got, did make enough money to make the trip worth it. Now, it was quite rare for these individual gold seekers to find huge fortunes. That was, of course, part of the myth of the time. The way the place was, that was the way the place was portrayed. Indiana. If you go into Indiana during these years, you would have seen advertised in newspapers there something called California Gold Grease. California Gold Grease. And this came in a tube, in a jar, and the claim here was this is what you needed to take with you out to California. Because once you got out to the gold fields, once you got up to California, what you need to do is strip down completely naked, slaver yourself with California gold grease, and then roll around on the ground to pick up the gold dust. Because all of California, was the land of California was literally covered with gold dust, and the problem, the only difficulty you had was sort of picking up the little pieces of it, and so you needed to sort of grease yourself down and pick it up. So that's the myth, and of course that's far from the truth. But to get back to your to get back to the question, the real wealth that came out of California went in fact to these larger companies that began to organize on a much larger scale, and to bring the new technologies of mining to bear. And they are the ones that made the money.
Quick question from Carrie. Did a lot of the miners end up staying in California, or did they travel back home after looking and finding or not finding gold?
Again, the answer is quite mixed. But a lot of them did remain out there. A lot of them caught on very quickly that there was more money to be made in other kinds of enterprises, selling things to the miners, other kinds of work. Everything from the production of lumber and flour to orchards and fruits. So what this did, among other things, and this is a very important point, I think, that we'll talk about in May, what the gold rush did was to establish on the far Pacific coast, as far as you could go in the United States without getting into the, still being in the United States, the great economic and cultural engine for the entire West, and that is California. California becomes, the dominant force in the development of the far West, and it's because of the gold rush. Any other questions here?
Okay, your image of greased-up naked miners rolling around on the ground seems to have captured the imagination of some folks. But I think we can move on. We've got about 20 minutes.
Okay, all right. Well, so suddenly, when we went to war with Mexico, nobody anticipated this. But suddenly, just literally at the time that the war ended, we began to realize that the far west, the farther edge of this the country that we had acquired from California was a place of unbelievable possibilities. And so we began to, and this is something again we'll look at in more detail in May. But one effect of this was a vast migration across the middle of the country. Now, what this table shows you is the overland migration that begins, of course, in early 1840s. Mostly, as you can see here, it's to Oregon, more than California. Oregon represents Western opportunity between 1840 and 1848, and that's the opportunity of farming. Those are the guys who went out there and began to establish farms, and of course, at the same time, to exclude black folks. Some going to California, but the majority of them to Oregon, and also, of course, to Utah with the Mormon migration. But look what happens after 1848. First thing you notice is that the raw numbers explode during those years. 200,000 by 1860 to California alone. And the second thing you notice is that the focus of that migration shifts dramatically away from Oregon to California and the gold fields. This is one of the great folk movements of American history. I think we often get the impression of the overland trails as being a few people going across the country, but this was a massive migration. And what it did was to create between the two, between Oregon and California, create a large and rapidly growing population on the far western edge of the country. So we'll talk about this more in May, but here's another interesting table. This shows the number of immigrants and the number of Indians killed along the overland trail. And what you can see here is that, first of all, the numbers are not great, but considerably more Indians killed by whites than whites killed by Indians.
We have a question here from Greg Elliott.
Sure.
Some of the migration come from California into Oregon. So was California like a stopping point?
Yes, and in fact that's true not just of Oregon, but much of the West. What you see is this huge influx of people first to California, and then as the gold began, as the opportunities began to dwindle there, and other gold strikes began to occur elsewhere in the West, and other places in the West began to open. You see this flood of people, this movement of people out of California up to Oregon, into the northern Rockies, into Idaho and Montana, down into the Southwest. So it's kind of think of it in terms of a huge movement of people out to the far West and then sort of washing back inward into the interior West after that. Any other questions on this?
Here we have a question. How accurate do you think these numbers are, considering the times they were compiled?
These numbers come from a book by a man named John Unruh called The Plains Across. It was published quite a while back. Professor Unruh tragically died soon after. He was a young man, and yet died soon after this was published. This still remains the sort of the standard work on far westward migration. And Unruh was extremely careful in his documentation. A lot of these numbers come from, especially those of the numbers of people and where they were heading, from Army posts along the trail. And the people in those posts, the officers in that post, kept very careful count of the number of wagons, the number of people who were passing through. So we can be pretty confident about these numbers. Now they have changed, and they changed upward. There have been some revisions since Unruh's book to push the total. Let me go back to this one. The total you see here.
We have another question here. I'm sorry. Let me just go back for 1 second, please. We have a question here. What is a white Indian? That note there, the immigrants presumably killed by white Indians.
Well, by the time that you see that, late in the 50s, there were bandits, in effect, along the road, who would prey upon these people going across. They would pose as Indians. And claimed that they were, and they were when the killings were made of these whites. As it turns out, they were not. They were blamed on Indians, but in fact they were whites, sort of desperados who were doing the killing.
Okay, thank you.
Back here, if you notice this number on the far right, 290, just under 300,000. That number has now been revised upward to about 320,000 persons crossing the country. So. Enormous flood of migration. Okay, that then leads then to this final stage. We're sort of winding down here of the relationship between the far west and expansion and the coming of the Civil War. With this sudden appearance of population in the far west, in California and Oregon, the immediate and obvious question was, how do you keep this part of the West within the nation, and very specifically, how do you connect it? How do you connect it? How the great majority of the American population, of course, is to the east of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers, and yet we've now got this very large and very rapidly growing population out in the far west. The two have got to be bound together. We've got to tie them together somehow. How are we going to do it? The obvious answer by the 1850s was the railroad. The railroad that was transforming the American economy and American life in many ways. And by the 1850s, there were already multiple calls for building the first transcontinental. It wouldn't be begun until after the Civil War, and wouldn't be completed until 1869. And again, we'll look at that in May. But at this time, the call was for the building of such a railroad. But consider this now. Whichever part of the country, and specifically whichever city on the east, would be the eastern end, the eastern terminus of that railroad, would think of the kinds of benefits that it would gain. If you were the connecting point to this enormously rich and this rapidly growing place out in the far west, what would that mean for your city, for your part of the country? So this became one of the great plums of the American economy, and therefore one of the great arguing points and one of the great battlegrounds of American politics. Which railroad will be built? Which route would the railroad take? So what you see here are the surveys done by several government Corps of Engineers parties that were sent out by the government. We sent these folks out west to determine what was the easiest and the best way to build that railroad. Can you see this well enough on the map? See those routes across there? Now notice one of them starts out of Chicago. There are a few routes there. One of them goes to the north. One goes through sort of the central plains through Nebraska and down through, one goes through Kansas. And now look down to the south. You can see the one going through Texas. Leads through Fort Smith, Arkansas, just south of where I am. Across Texas, across the south. So the question here was then, which of these routes would be taken? And whichever route was taken, that would also determine which city in the east, and specifically and more generally, which region of the east, the south, the middle, or the north would benefit from that connection. Now this was all done under the leadership of the Secretary of War in the 1850s. The Secretary of War who was in charge of these surveys, was none other than Jefferson Davis, the man who would later, of course, be the leader of the Confederacy. Davis, of course, obviously, with Southern sympathies, placed a great deal of emphasis on the southern route. He wanted the railroad to be built out of Arkansas, connected to the Deep South, so that would give the South a connection to the far west, and therefore a huge advantage. Others, of course, wanted another route. The problem with those routes to the north, now compare these two maps. The problem, one of the prime problems of building a railroad across Nebraska or across Kansas to benefit a city like Chicago, was that those areas under the Compromise of 1850 were unorganized territory that was called specifically Indian country, a place to be left to the Indians. So what this meant in practical terms was that if a city like Chicago or any other northern city was to benefit from this railroad, that area would have to be organized into territories in order for the railroad to be built across it. And so that became the motive for the proposal of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the famous Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, did all of you have a chance to review that, what that law did?
Okay, we see it right there on the map.
So it created these two territories, Kansas and Nebraska. Who was anybody remember who the politician was who proposed this law?
Anybody got that handy? Who did that? Douglas.
Right. Stephen Douglas of Illinois. So it was he was the leading he was the great rising star of the Democratic Party. And Stephen Douglas, in order to get this great benefit for his state of Illinois, for Chicago, for the city of Chicago, and for the Midwest in general, and proposed to organize this area into these two territories, Kansas and Nebraska. That would allow, that would overcome this problem. That would open the way for the building of this railroad to connect Chicago and the Midwest to the far west. A huge benefit for all of them. The problem with that was in order to get support for that law, he had to compromise with Southerners and reopen the question that had been supposedly closed by the Missouri Compromise by leaving it up to each of those territories, Kansas and Nebraska, whether or not they would be slave or they would be free. So what this law did then was reopen the question of slavery in the West, slavery in the territories of the West, the question that supposedly had been closed first by the Missouri Compromise and then reopened and then closed with the Compromise of 1850, and now Douglas was opening it again. And that, in turn, that became in effect, the trigger of the coming of the Civil War. And what we have here is a very long Is this the full excerpt, Richard, of the?
Yeah, that's the full excerpt. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, here we go. Here's the shorter version of it. This became, in the view of many in the North, a huge crime against the nation, against the whole principle of keeping slavery and blacks out of the West. Sir, the Nebraska bill was in every way, every respect, a swindle. It was a swindle by the South of the North. It was on the part of those who had already completely enjoyed their share of the Missouri Compromise, a swindle of those whose share was yet absolutely untouched. Slavery has been forcibly introduced into Kansas and placed under the formal safeguards of pretended law. So what he's saying was this was a conspiracy, a criminal, in effect, a criminal conspiracy between people like Douglas, who were acting out of his own political motives, and Southerners to reverse the policy of the past and to open up this country to slavery and to blacks. And remember now, what we're talking about here, the impulse behind keeping slavery out of the West, and Kansas and Nebraska as well, is as much racist as it is idealistic. So it's the combination of those two impulses, the determination to keep slavery out of the West for moral reasons, and the racial and economic motive of keeping slavery out of the West to keep the West lily white, that combines then to create this final explosion that comes about in Kansas.
We have two questions from Greg. He wants to know about the impact of the action, I presume it's Kansas-Nebraska Act, on transportation in the North. Did it give Northerners better transportation and better access to the West?
Eventually it would. Now remember, the railroad would not actually be built until after the Civil War. It was not completed until 1869. But once it did, it did give greater access, and in fact it did. A huge economic boost to those cities on the eastern end of it. Chicago, Douglas's dream for Chicago is realized. Chicago emerges as one of the great American cities, and it's because of that rail connection to the far west.
We have another question here. Wasn't there a lot of behind-the-scenes money lobbying for votes in Congress for the different rail lines?
Absolutely. It's one of the, and it turns out to be, especially a little bit later, when you look at it later, one of the most politically corrupt episodes in American history. Yeah. Okay. This then led to cartoons like this. The feeling that slavery was being forced down the gullet of the people of the West, and what it did, of course, also was to lead immediately to this conflict in Kansas itself. It was assumed. Look back to this map now. We're getting close to the end, I realize. It was assumed by that compromise that Kansas would become slave. After all, it was immediately to the west of Missouri, and Missouri was a slave state. So the assumption was that the Southerners, the South, would get Kansas. The North, the free states, would get Nebraska. But folks like Sumner, who saw it this way, were determined not to let that happen. And so they began to organize and to send free soilers, that is, those people opposed to the expansion of slavery, into Kansas. They openly armed them. They sent they were called Beecher's Bibles. These were cartons, large containers that were labeled Bibles that were in fact guns, firearms, that were sent into Kansas to arm the free soilers to prevent slavery from being introduced there. So what we have then in Kansas in the 1850s is, in effect, the beginning of the Civil War in so many terms. It's in Kansas in the 1850s that you first see Americans killing other Americans over the issue of slavery, in this case specifically the expansion of slavery into the West. I encourage all of you to go to the website and look at this entire document. It's the recollection one of those free soil fighters, one of those men who goes out to Kansas to fight. Here's a quote from it. I am determined, however, to stay in Kansas and fulfill the object of my coming, which is to assist and, if possible, make Kansas a free state. And in his this document, he describes organizing with his friends, marching on slave bastions, outright fighting, killings, massacres. It's a pretty bloody episode. So in a way, in a sense, what you can say is that even though we normally associate the beginning of the Civil War with Fort Sumter in 1861, it really in effect begins in the 1850s in Kansas, and it begins in the West and because of the West. So here is the final connection, I think, between westward expansion and the coming of the war.
And we will leave the story there and take it up again in May, but before that we'll have a few seminars that will explore the Civil War. Have we addressed all of your questions? We've come to the end of our seminar. Here's your chance to pose any additional questions or make any additional comments before we wrap things up. Dr. West, so good to hear you speak again. Oh, here for somebody, you have a fan from your first NEH conference out in Boulder some time ago.
Right.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, so thank you for your participation. Professor West will be monitoring the forum until January 21st, so if you have any questions or comments you'd like to post there and have him respond, he will be available to the 21st of January on the forum. In the meantime, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for your participation. I want to thank Elliott for your intelligent and wise leadership of the seminar. Please don't forget to submit your evaluations, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you very much.
And thank all of you.